Graham Bodie with us. He's a visiting professor in our school, and his expertise is on listening, civil discourse. He's done a tremendous amount of research in this area, and is also a highly regarded presenter on these topics. And so, considering that we're in a climate in our country right now where civil discourse could certainly be ramped up, we feel that this is a terrific time to have Dr. Bodie speak to you, and thank the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning for making this a sponsored program this fall. So with that, I'll be quiet and let Dr. Bodie take over.
Thank you.
That was a moment ago. I didn't get a chance to when he was describing Chinese investments and so forth.
Hold on a second.
Mr. President, I'm still speaking.
I'm sorry.
Mr. President, let me finish. I'm going to continue.
You can make it short. See all these people, they've been waiting for you. Could you
Just
make
going to
it
make a
short?
point. Any investments I have over the last 8 years have been managed by a blind trust. And I understand they do include investments outside the United States, including in Chinese companies. Mr. President, have you looked at your pension? Have you looked at your pension?
I've got to say.
Mr. President, have you looked at your pension?
You know, I don't look at my pension. It's not as big as yours, so it doesn't
Let me give you some advice.
I check it that often.
Let me give you some advice. Look at your pension. You also have investments in Chinese companies. You also have investments outside the United States. You also have investments through a Cadence Trust.
We're still way on topic here, Governor and we want to I can have you sit down, Governor Romney. Thank you.
And I appreciate that question.
We have not seen
Mr. President, let me move you on
serious
here,
about this
please.
issue at all.
Mr.
And it's
President.
time for them to get serious on it. This used to be my partisan issue. The day after the attack, Governor, I stood in the Rose Garden and I told the American people and the world that we were going to find out exactly what happened, that this was an act of terror, and I also said that we're going to hunt down those who committed this crime. And then a few days later, I was there greeting the caskets coming into Andrews Air Force Base and grieving with the families. And the suggestion that anybody in my team, whether Secretary of State, our UN ambassador, anybody on my team would play politics or mislead when we've lost 4 of our own, Governor, is offensive. That's not what we do. That's not what I do as president. That's not what I do as commander-in-chief.
Governor, if you want to...
I think it's interesting the president just said something which is that on the day after the attack, he went to the Rose Garden and said that this was an act of terror. You said in the Rose Garden, the day after the attack, it was an act of terror. It was not a spontaneous demonstration. Is that what you're saying?
Please proceed, Governor.
I want to make sure we get that for the record, because it took the president 14 days before he called the attack in Benghazi an act of terror.
Get the transcript.
He did, in fact, sir. So let me call it an act of terror.
Can you say that a little louder,
He did call it an act of terror. It did as well take 2 weeks or so for the whole idea of there being a riot out there about this tape to come out. You're correct about that.
The administration indicated that this was a reaction to a video and was a spontaneous reaction. It took them a long time to say this was a terrorist act by a terrorist group. And to suggest, am I incorrect in that regard? On Sunday, your secretary, the ambassador of the United Nations, went to the Sunday television shows and spoke about how this was a spontaneous reaction.
I'm happy to have a longer conversation about foreign policy.
Absolutely, but I want to move you on, and also you can go to the transcripts.
I just want to make sure that all these wonderful folks are going to have a chance to get some of their questions answered.
So in your individual groups at your table, if you'll just take about 2 minutes to talk about your initial reactions to this clip. particularly with respect to what in these moments did you see as uncivil behavior, if anything? So go ahead and have a conversation among yourselves. All right, so what are some initial thoughts about whether or not any of these behaviors might be classified as uncivil?
Yes.
Yes?
They couldn't hear each other. They were all talking at the same time.
Okay. And by all, you mean not just the two candidates, but also
And the debaters.
right, everybody.
Doesn't it matter about the reason why they were having a debate that's different than having a conversation?
How?
I think that they're trying to outshow the other. It's a contentious situation anyway. It's not like a everyday conversation. So I think they're working towards their point.
Sure.
By any means.
So the very context itself as a debate, right, sets up the potential for behaviors to be at least perceptually uncivil or rude or talking over. At the same time, this particular debate, toward the end, there was a section of the debate that they were supposed to talk to each other, right, if you remember this particular context. So, and that last clip was part of that, even though Obama was addressing, Romney only minimally, right? But your point is well taken in terms of the context of a debate, right? Just that word itself might sort of leak out behaviors that we would otherwise kind of not engage in everyday conversation. What else? What other thoughts?
Interruption.
Okay. And so why is interruption maybe an uncivil act?
Because it's aggressive, because you don't want to hear what the other person wants to say. You want to be heard, or you want to speak, so whether you get heard or not. You disregard their need to be heard as well.
Right.
You're not talking to each other, you're talking to your constituency. You're not talking to each other, they're talking to me.
Right, you're just talking over each
They're
other.
talking way beyond each other.
Right. So this notion of incivility, or its counterpart really, civil discourse, has really proven to be a pretty complicated task, or just to define what this is. On the one hand, you've got a host of scholarly definitions that center on notions of respect and a host of logical fallacies such as ad hominem attacks and intentionally misleading comments aimed to bring one's opponent down. Most of these definitions have been formed from analyses of political discourse. And so you have these scholarly definitions framed around politics and political discourse. On the other hand, there are public perceptions of incivility, both what counts as uncivil discourse and whether our discursive landscape is becoming more or less rancorous. Multiple studies show that Americans believe that we are more uncivil and disrespectful as a society now than in years past, and that the future is not very bright in this regard. Within the larger conversation about what constitutes civil discourse, there are several organizations that are attempting to restore a sense of respect and order to American political discourse in particular. Today I'm going to focus primarily on the Listen First Project. It's a relatively new organization, and it serves as an umbrella for other organizations. It has partnerships with over 25 regional, national, and international organizations, some of which are displayed here. I'll also be drawing a lot from the National Institute for Civil Discourse, which is at the University of Arizona, a couple of studies that they've funded, as well as a couple of initiatives that they've advanced. Most of the National Institute is in the context of politics, as well as Listen First, because the founder of Listen First was a lobbyist for several years in Washington, D.C. But there are other efforts and other movements that you can look for. Actually, if anybody was aware, the Huffington Post came here to Oxford recently. Was anybody go to any of those events? When I talked to someone, so Pierce Godwin, the Listen First Project founder, I talked to him, and he was on tour with Huffington Post, and I talked to him, and he said they said Oxford was one of the more interesting places they've been, actually, because of the diversity of political views. They said you have you've got it all in Oxford. So they're really actually thrilled to be here, and they have a lot of stories about Oxford. Before we get to the role of listening in particular, there's a few interesting claims that are out there that I want to address with respect to civil discourse. I think these also make for really good discussion with students in a classroom atmospheres. Assertions you can throw out and have them kind of debate and dialogue about. And one such activity actually is included in your handouts at the back. It's called the assertion jar. And we'll talk a little bit about that activity as well as some other activities that you can do with students to get them talking about issues, particularly with respect to what's the role of civil discourse in this classroom and in society at large. What does it even mean to engage in civil discourse? So the first myth that you've heard me talk about already is that today's political climate is unique, more uncivil than any other period in our history. He's a petty, mean, egotistic, erratic, eccentric, jealous, natural, hot-tempered. There are great and intrinsic defects in his character. Who said this? Close. This was Hamilton talking of John Adams. If he were to win the election, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The soil will be soaked with blood.
Somebody said that about Thomas Jefferson.
Someone said that about Thomas Jefferson. Before Lying Ted or Crooked Hillary, there was Blaine, James G. Blaine, the monumental liar from the state of Maine, and there was Andrew Jackass. Trump isn't the first to call people names, and he may not even be the worst, even though perhaps in today's day and age we may have to ascribe him as being the worst. Nevertheless, several studies report that a majority of Americans believe that our political discourse is rude and nasty and getting worse. They see the country headed in the wrong direction, which leads to the second myth, which is everyone agrees regarding what uncivil or civil even means. And you probably saw even among the people at your table where you had differences of opinion with respect to the video that I showed from a couple of elections ago. So there's, like I said earlier, there's several scholarly definitions that are out there. I drew this from it's a fabulous review, was published in the Arizona Law Review by a couple of scholars, I believe out of the University of Arizona. And so they basically have these kind of 8 categories of what counts as uncivil discourse, that they call kind of a starting place. Kind of like there may be some gray areas, but we can kind of like all agree that these are fundamentally bad. And so you have things like ad hominem attacks, false and negative statements, A lot of name calling, vulgarity, and these kinds of things that most people would agree to as being uncivil in some respects. Interestingly, from a communication standpoint, someone who got his PhD in communication, a lot of these lists could have just as simply been drawn from, and if this will open, lists of traditional fallacies in argument, right? So this is a list from a guy named Bob Gass, but there's other lists out there of traditional kind of fallacies in arguing or fallacies in reasoning. And so once you make a fallacy in arguing or a fallacy in reasoning, potentially you've engaged in some sort of uncivil behavior. So you've got the scholarly definitions, right? More interesting in a lot of ways, though, are what do people, right, what does the lay public, not just what do the experts think, what does the lay public think? And not just about political discourse, but about discourse that is on social media or other kind of websites and so forth, right? And so this is from a study. There was a couple of studies that was funded by the National Institute for Civil Discourse. A colleague of mine, Stephen Rains from the University of Arizona, was an author on this. And basically, they looked at a couple of things. So the first thing they did is define uncivil discourse as features of discussion that convey an unnecessarily disrespectful tone toward the discussion forum, its participants, or its topics. So they're taking that straight from that Arizona Law Review definition, right? And so they applied this definition to looking at the Arizona Daily Star, which is the biggest newspaper in their market. And they found that in the span of their sample, about 20%, 1 in 5 posts, these are people who were posting comments to newspaper stories. About 20% had some form of one of these types of uncivil discourse, with most of them being name-calling. So name-calling seems to not only be a central component of scholarly definitions, but that's what's used. That's what people are using. They're calling people a variety of terms. And then what they did is they took examples of these forms of uncivil discourse, and they presented them to participants, both a representative sample of individuals. I believe they used MTurk or one of these recruiting tools to get non-college students, and then they replicated it with a group of college students, asking them the degree to which they believe these forms of putatively uncivil discourse are perceived to be uncivil. Interestingly, the most interesting finding in their study wasn't that people agreed that name-calling was uncivil, right, and vulgarity rather uncivil, right, but that they didn't see these other forms of uncivil discourse as being any more uncivil than disagreement. In particular, disagreement that was not framed as data-driven. So you can call out incorrect data, right? You can say like, the author says that 20% of people do this, but really only 18% of people do this. And that's fine. That's not uncivil, right? But if you aren't citing data, if you're just stating disagreement, participants in both studies thought that was uncivil. So what does that mean for our ability to teach our students, right, to respectfully disagree, right, in order to change things if fundamentally people perceive disagreement? If you disagree with me, you're being uncivil. You're engaging in some behavior that's unwarranted or rude or disrespectful, right? So just the nature of disagreement is problematic, right, from the standpoint of perceptions of what constitutes civility, civil discourse, right, and uncivil behavior. That scared me, frankly, that we're going to have an issue here of teaching our students how to disagree when disagreement fundamentally is seen as uncivil. The third myth is that good or civil public discourse requires politeness or polite speech. And that comes out of this notion of like, can you even disagree these days without being seen as rude or arrogant or something else? In a book that was published about a decade ago called The Discourse of Civility, Barber says, civility confronts brute force with reason. It distinguishes democracy, or the politics of reason defined at a minimum as intersubjectivity, from tyranny, or the politics of force. Incivility is not a rude form of political discourse, but a polite form of political violence. When we cultivate a truly civil media that respects reason in a civil society, we ground our politics in a civility that makes it responsible and empowering. Civility is the quest for commonality despite honest differences, responsibility despite antagonism, recognition of the other despite divergent self-interests. It is not just about the tenor or the tone of our politics, but about its very substance. Some acts go against current norms and perhaps are considered uncivil at the time, but that ultimately advance democracy, inclusion, and civil rights. I listened to an interesting podcast the other day, and the whole subject was, maybe we need a little bit of incivility to advance democracy. And so he was making these really important distinctions conceptually between civility, incivility, democracy, politeness, and other concepts that often get conflated and mixed together as being the same thing. That we can disagree in sometimes a rancorous manner and not necessarily be uncivil or undemocratic. The final myth is that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching and modeling civil discourse. Our perceptions and our notions of civility and civil discourse are shaped by cultural norms, by race, by class, by gender, by a variety of different individual and social variables. And the notions of civility are continually shaped and reshaped. They're never stagnant. They're always in flux. We're always changing what it even means to have a civil society in the first place. And even though there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, I think, and this is my bias, that any discussion of civil discourse has to include and perhaps has to start with a discussion of how to listen to difference. How to find something, one thing, anything, within the speech of another person that you can validate, even if you disagree. How to respect others by allowing them time and space to share their opinions without fear of being shut down or otherwise demeaned. And so while I think there's plenty of valid definitions of civil discourse, I like the one provided in a recent talk by Carolyn Long. She's in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at Washington State University, Vancouver. She defines incivility as individuals being unwilling to speak to another due to the difference in their perspectives. Just the blatant unwillingness to even engage with someone else who you have a difference with. And if you're faced with difference, that basically pushback of, as my daughter said the other day, talk to the hand, right? She literally had a hand on, a face on her hand, right? So, it's that kind of like, I'm not even going to engage with you because we're different, or I perceive that there's this difference between us. And so what do we do? Here are my laudable goals, I suppose. First of all, I think university classrooms have to work to be sites of social transformation where instructors of record and students find ways to communicate effectively. What does this sound like? Well, it sounds like the point number 3 in the general education mission, where we assist our students in becoming informed and involved citizens in a democratic society. And again, this is my bias, but I think we best do that through teaching them to argue civilly. To take argumentation and debate. To take public speaking courses. To take persuasive writing courses. And if you can't take all of these courses because you have to, take math and physics, then you need to have those things infused in your own curriculum in order to model best practices of how to disagree, but do so in a way that we might consider civil or respectful. And this is two-pronged. I think, coming from the communication discipline, our discipline has done a fabulous job of teaching people how to debate and argue and speak their mind and speak their views. This notion, there's various models out there, but this R model, some of you may be familiar with this assertion, reasoning, evidence, that getting students not only just to, students like to do this both in writing and in speaking, right? They just state their opinion. I believe, and then they sit down, right? And there's no why. What's the substance? Why do you believe what you believe? What's the reasoning behind that? And so to teach them not only to make an assertion, not only to state an opinion, but to reason through that opinion and then to provide evidence for why they believe what they believe, right? Classic theories of persuasion, for instance, find that those beliefs that we hold the most dear tend to be what are called cultural truisms that we never question and therefore are the easiest to persuade us to change our opinions. McGuire showed this after the Korean War when people came home and they were questioning values like freedom and democracy and capitalism because they had been in communist camps. And they didn't have to, North Koreans didn't have to torture these soldiers. All they had to do was basically question, why do you believe in democracy? Right? And they hadn't thought through the reasoning and the evidence for why they believe in these fundamental principles, right? So we got to teach our students to assert and to reason and to provide evidence, but more importantly, and what we typically don't do a lot of, is instruction on how to respectfully disagree, and not just huff and puff when we're faced with resistance. I think it's a multi-step process. One of the ones that I've found useful is restatement, refutation, support, and conclusion. Right, where you first restate or paraphrase what the other person's argument is and not, you said this, but what I heard you express is this. So that you're taking the emphasis off of me and you, right? And you, but this is what I've heard, this is what I'm taking from it. And once you've restated that, right, then you refute that. You say, I understand that I understand your position being this, but here's how I respectfully disagree with that. And then again, providing support for that disagreement and concluding that disagreement with some sort of warrant, right? Some sort of reasoning, logic, some sort of evidence, and so forth. Right? I believe this begins with the model that I call listen first, and that's fundamentally demonstrated, I think, very well by the organization that I've been involved with called the Listen First Project. So what is this thing that we call listening? All right, so starting on page 2 of your handout, maybe some of you filled out the bubbles there. There's about 67 potential synonyms for listening. I could have put more, but I stopped at 67. So if you've got that filled out, what I want you to do is look at the ones that you circled 4 or 5 for. And just kind of list those somewhere on the page. Chances are you only have about a handful of them. If you didn't do your homework, then I'll give you a couple minutes here to do your homework. If you, yes, A+.
There you go.
All right, so once you've had a chance to do that and you've got the items that you've circled for or 5 for, this is a chance for you to, again, talk amongst yourselves at your tables, right? Where are the similarities? Where are the differences? Why do you see listening the way that you see listening? And why might other people see listening a little bit differently than you?
I want to know what apprehending is.
Because I'm going to come to class now at 1 o'clock and I'm going to tell my
I put
there are 67 synonyms for this.
Well, potential synonyms.
You are not.
What do you mean by apprehending?
If you apprehend something, you get it, you understand it,
So as opposed to the other meaning, which is to take it by force.
yeah.
Because that's the first thing I don't see it.
Not apprehending someone, but
Stress.
it's more like James's notion of like apperception, kind of like sensing something, getting something. Yeah.
This is great. I teach in negotiation.
Oh yeah.
And we talk about imagotherapy. We talk about listening.
Active listening. Yeah.
Active listening, separating the people from the problem, mirroring.
Right. Yeah.
It's all that kind of
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
I can't listen to you and hear the thing at the same time. I know that about myself. So if I'm really listening to you, that's
You need a group. You guys need to be in a group. Got it. Blogging, huh?
She wants the right answer.
What's the right answer for smelling? I mean, listening is a whole body experience. So some would say that olfactory senses are a very important part of taking in the environment. So people who are deaf technically listen because sound waves go through our bodies, right? So they just happen to, because we're humans, reverberate most locally here in our ears. But we're feeling, if we pay attention, we're feeling all those sound waves.
Good answer.
So you can smell it maybe. If the person you're talking to doesn't have good breath, maybe. I don't know. All right, so who was right? Who got the right answer? Joyce got the right answer? So your tables, were there a lot of differences? Were there a lot of similarities? What was some of the dynamics? A lot of incivility over here? You can't eat your cookies. We hadn't heard from this table back here. What did you guys find? A lot of differences, a lot of similarities?
We're not speaking to each other. We talked about responding, whether that's part of listening or not.
Mm-hmm.
Listening is just keeping your mouth shut and trying to understand, or your gestures and responses have to do with listening, where they set the process.
Right. Well, yeah. You'll hear my answer about that in a minute, but.
Listen, he's asking good questions.
What else? Why does this matter, right? Why does it matter that You had certain things circled as 4 or 5, then you had other things, and you had other things, and you had other things.
So we all can't agree on what listening is.
If you can't agree on what listening is, then how are you going to do it together the correct way, right? So one of the things that I think is important for any organization, whether that organization is a for-profit company or a classroom, for a particular semester, if you're going to talk about the importance of listening to each other, to civil discourse, to having these kinds of dialogues, if we have 30 people in the classroom and 30 different kind of conceptualizations of what this thing is, that listening, right, then we're going to be in a conversation and Mike's going to go, "You're not listening to me." And I was like, "I'm absolutely listening to you." Well, I'm not according to his definition, right, but I am according to my own definition, right? And so we have these arguments on this meta level about what are we even doing in this conversation if we're not listening to each other, if we're not having civil, right, dialogue with each other. I like this activity for organizations or groups to come up with their kind of internal definition of listening. So I've done this with a couple of groups where I give this questionnaire out and have all the members do it, and then they sort of realize that there's 3 people in the 3 or 4 people in the group. There's 3 or 4 different lists of things with 4 or 5s, but they've got to come to an agreement about what are those 4 or 5 essential terms that we're going to use to craft our own definition of listening for this project or for this group. And I think you can do that with students as well. For this semester, our working definition of listening or of civility or whatever it is that, whatever you want to call it is, right? And you write it out and they all kind of write it down, and they, you can have them memorize it or whatever the case might be, so that they're all on that same page together. So my definition, my working definition, I see listening as having 3 primary components. Variously called them sort of the affective component, the cognitive component, and the behavioral component. Right? And I think all 3 of these are important for different reasons. The affective component, what some call sensing, is a variety of kind of the willingness to or the motivation to listen. Just that willingness to be present and open to disagreement or to other ideas. The cognitive component is kind of what, Robert, you were talking about. When people don't want to include responding in a definition, they're usually audiologists or people who are in that physics tradition, where it's all information processing. It's all sort of physiological, hearing, remembering, evaluating. It's all up here. And once you start speaking, that's a different process, right? Fundamentally, that's, in my mind, misrepresenting the primary way in which people assess whether we're doing the thing we say we're doing. And that is, if you're not behaving in certain ways, people say you're not listening, even if you're doing a bunch of stuff up here. And I'm probably the world's worst at this because I'm a very up here person. And there's not a lot of stuff coming out of here, and I'm not a very emotional person. I'm not a very non-verbally yay person. My wife's over there, so I'm trying not to look at her. Right? I'm not very non-verbally active, right? And so I'm doing a lot of this, and in my definition of list, I'm doing a lot of listening, but if I'm not doing a lot of this, the other people aren't believing me, right? So my argument for including responding, for including the behavioral component in there, is if you're not doing certain behaviors that the other person or persons in the room sort of ascribe to good listening, it doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter your attitude. It doesn't matter what you're doing up in your head, right? If you're not outwardly displaying. But it also means that the most interesting question I've ever gotten at a conference was, can you fake genuine listening? Right? That grad student came to study with me. I was very excited about that. Can you fake genuine listening? And I think to a certain extent, yes, because you can do the things that people ascribe as good listening, what lots of you are doing right now, yeah, right, and paraphrasing and doing these kind of things. But at the same time, there's research to show that people who are distracted do the the yes, and the rights, what we call generic responding, they can go anywhere in the conversation, but where there is a huge detriment in distracted listeners is specific responding. Looking surprised when you should be surprised, looking sad when you should be sad. The students in your classroom, when you say something like you give a conceptual definition of a complex term and they're laughing and you're like, all right, what are you doing on your computer back there in the back of the classroom, right? And so that responding, I think, that's my argument, Robert, for why it's got to be there in any definition of listening, at least from my perspective, is because without it, it's the only outward sign that anything's going on up here. So in terms of listening in particular, before I show you two kind of examples of how you might incorporate some of this stuff in your classroom, are three primary myths about listening, the first of which is it's agreeing. So very much like civil discourse being, right, disagreement is uncivil, a lot of people think, you're not listening to me if you're not agreeing. This comes from when my daughter was in 3-year-old pre-K, the teacher said something that made me both like the proudest parent ever and wonder what's going on in pre-K, which was, she's such a good listener. I was like, that's awesome, but then I thought, what does that mean? And what did that mean back then for a 3-year-old? She's being obedient. She stands in line. She washes her hands. She doesn't talk back, right? And because we're taught from an early age that listening basically means obedience, we grow up to think if someone's disagreeing with me, they're not listening to me. When in fact, I'm probably listening to you more closely than I've ever listened to anybody in my life, right? But I just don't think you're right. I just disagree with you, right? And so listening isn't necessarily agreeing. It's also not a panacea. As you'll see if you explore the Listening First website, there are sort of some behaviors that step over the line where certain people don't deserve to be listened to unconditionally, right? It's not one of those, and it doesn't solve all problems. Right? Richard Spencer is going to be Richard Spencer no matter how much someone listens to him. Right? And finally, that it's easy, that it's something that how many people have ever had a class in listening? 1, 2, right? It's more that hands that usually go up when I ask that question, right? But how many people have had a class in public speaking? Many more hands, right? We don't have classes to teach us how to listen, but we assume that it's easy. Right? We assume that, I do it all the time, and therefore, right, it must be easy. So the Listen First project is a group of primarily millennials. I'm not one of them, but most of them are millennials who really have this passion for kind of changing political discourse through promoting this notion of listen first and having a series of different types of what we're calling listen first conversations around controversial issues. Charlottesville being kind of the primary catalyst for a lot of the recent stuff that we've been doing with this organization. Hopefully we'll have a conference there soon. The mayor's on board and several other big names are jumping on board as well. So what can you do with your students? So the Listen First project, in my mind, given that model of listen that I presented, is about that affective or motivational component. It's about getting students to first and foremost kind of say out loud, I promise to listen first, so that it's always there as a reminder, right? And so how do you do that? You go to the website and you click on Take Action and Pledge to Listen First. And so I'd encourage you, if you're going to do any of these kind of activities in your classrooms, you take your students through this activity, right, and having them basically take this pledge, which is I will fully listen to and consider another's views before sharing my own. I will prioritize respect and understanding in conversation, and I will encourage others to do the same. It's pretty simple. And then once they take that pledge, there are other resources on here for... Oh, it's not shown on the screen.
At the very top left, you should say mirror display or something. I'm sorry. 2016 is causing me a problem. Where are you at? Use slideshow. Okay. Now you're.
Okay.
You see what it is.
There we go. It's not wanting to go to the website. Anyway, so the website's easy, listenfirstproject.org, right? And there's a pledge that the students can take, as well as there's a set of guidelines that we're continually revising, but they're up there about like what is a listen first conversation, what do you do before the conversation, during the conversation, after the conversation, and you can model some of this, right? One of the more interesting resources that's actually been put out by the Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona is called Text, Talk, Revive Civility. All right, what's going on? There we go. So nicd.arizona.edu. If you want to try, if you have a cell phone, right, it's one of those times where you can take it out without being rude. You can text civility to 89800, and your group will then receive a series of text messages that guide you through a 1-hour conversation on civility. It's about what does it look like? What does it look like in conversation? What does it mean to people in your group? Right? How can you help restore civility in politics and everyday life? So it's just a conversation about what is civility, right? How do we restore it? And again, so if you have a 50-minute class, you do a very brief introduction, or maybe you do an introduction on Monday, right? And then on Wednesday, right, you tell them bring your cell phone to class. We're going to use that, and you put them into groups, kind of like you are, in groups of like 6 or 7, and they can all have, it can start a conversation about what is civility. What does it mean to have civil discourse, right? You can incorporate some listening stuff in there because there's not a lot of stuff on listening explicitly in that. But nevertheless, another, and there's stuff, promotional stuff for adults, for children, and so forth. The other resource is on the back of the handouts. There's, I just gave you one page of a 30 or so page document. If you notice on the front of your handouts, I put a private page on my website. It's just myname.com/CETL, and it's got a bunch of resources. It's got the listening assessment that you took, circle the synonym thing. It's got the 3 readings that are referenced at the front if you need something to fall asleep to. And then it's got some podcasts, and it's got a couple of other links there as well. So you don't have to memorize or write everything down diligently. But one of the things it has on there is this teaching civil discourse. I think that's what it's called, or teaching resources for civil discourse. It's targeted to what it looks like kind of 8th grade, 9th grade, high school kids. And so some of the language is a little bit kind of, young for college students, but you can adapt that to college students. And the assertion jar was an example of something I thought was useful, that you basically have students write down assertions on pieces of paper, and then on those days that, this works great for an argumentation, a debate, public speaking class, but it would work well for other classes as well, is that when you have some downtime, pull an assertion out of the jar and have them practice both assertion, right, reasoning evidence, as well as someone disagreeing, right, in that restatement, reasoning support conclusion model, right? So you can have them model these types of conversations because, as we know as teachers, right, repetition is the mother of all learning, and as well as if you don't practice these behaviors, you can talk theoretically, and conceptually all day long, but without actually practicing these behaviors, students won't ever really get it. So at this point, I'll shut up and entertain, questions if you have them, or ideas. I'm sure some of you do other kinds of activities that might be useful to the group if you want to share those as well. Yeah?
I thought it was interesting the clip you shared that mentioned about the difference of civility being tyranny versus democracy. Because when I was thinking about with the exercise of what is civil or uncivil, I thought, well, what if civility was kind of or what we perceive as civility is really the adherence to respect based on some kind of authoritative figures or documents or beliefs that kind of control how we think about things or address it. And so I was thinking, I mean, the word vulgar itself means common people. So what we think of, as you mentioned, that this kind of idea that civility is degrading over time, if really what's happening is authority is losing its control over the common people. We're no longer bound to certain parameters of discussion or interaction with each other based on strict or blind adherence to religious doctrine or the Constitution or other ideals or kind of sacred texts or sacred cows in society. And now, instead of just a few elites who have control of the media, every Joe Blow with a YouTube channel has joined into civil discussion. And so is civility or incivility really just a march or a movement away from the kind of tyrannical control of discourse to the democratization of discourse? And what we consider vulgarity is really just, this is how the common people interact. And so is civility really, or incivility, or the degrading of civility, really the democratization of discourse?
Yeah, you should definitely listen to the podcast, and I've got it up on that that page, and it basically kind of makes that point that something like the suffrage movement was fundamentally uncivil at the time because women weren't supposed to speak in public against men. I mean, that was uncivil. That was rude behavior, right? And it fundamentally changed for the better, right? The society, right? The same thing with any civil rights movement, right? And so I think you're right. I think there's something to this kind of going against authority, or at least if it's not authority, social norms of behavior that we've somehow agreed upon. And because you're kind of shifting the boundaries of what is considered like appropriate social discourse, you're because you're not in that space, you're outside of that space, you must be uncivil. And we don't have any other word to call it, so we just call it uncivil, right? When it could be something else, right? So yeah, it was a great point. Yeah.
Academically, not politically, academically, our president's tweets, our president's speeches, our president's activities that seem to be by some divisive. As an academic, use what you just told us in analyzing.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think a lot of the speech, particularly the name. He's well known for name calling. Putting aside the untruths or the things that just aren't true, right? Like stating things that are wrong. Aside from those instances, the name calling and so forth, I think, has been a part of our political discourse forever, right? Is it my preference? No, right? I don't necessarily, I would prefer not to have politicians calling other politicians, crooked whatever and lying whatever and, last name being a vulgar word. But at the same time, is it uncivil? By scholarly definitions, it is uncivil, because uncivil is, vulgarity is included in that definition, right? But there's a difference between maybe that level of uncivility and whether it is a threat to democracy, right? And I'm not convinced it's a threat to democracy, right? In fact, it might actually advance democracy to some extent because it allows people who may not have otherwise, right, entered into the conversation. And maybe we didn't want them to enter the conversation for various reasons, but it does at least, allow people that were outside of the conversation to feel like they can speak in ways that we might consider uncivil, but nevertheless give them a voice, right?
What about number 2 on this page, civility and democratic engagement? Speech that is recklessly false and negative about the political approach.
Yes.
That's intentionally misleading.
And that's why I said, taking those aside, which may be 99% of it, right? But taking those aside, like fundamentally just false statements, right? Untruths. I'm not willing to say, we can just say whatever we want to say without necessarily being truthful. I don't.
I think he represents a real departure in that way. Not that politicians haven't lied before.
Yeah.
But reckless
But again, trying to separate on civil behavior from things that threaten democracy, from politeness, from, right, all these concepts that often get conflated, right? While it might be uncivil, does it threaten democracy? Is it a threat to democracy? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. Yeah.
You talked about cultural truisms being one of the challenges for us with our students in particular. And you mentioned democracy being one, that democracy is good.
Yeah.
It's sort of one of our cultural truisms. Are there, in your experience in doing this, are there others that our students are bringing to the table that you could identify, 3 or 4? What are some of the things that are just baked into often our students that we may want them to think about?
Yeah, that's, so I think on the opposite side of democracy is good, or, freedom of speech, right? The unabashed or, no holds barred freedom of speech. What does that even mean, and why, should we allow all, freedom of all speech? Is what counts as hate speech? Is that, should you be able to say hateful things? I think a lot of them also just the notion of like more voices is always good, right? Which may be true, but we don't question that. We just say inclusion and diversity, and we mean different things by those terms. And so I think even questioning some of the things that maybe in a liberal institution, right, in a thought-provoking institution we take for granted, freedom of speech, inclusion and diversity, let's question those things as well. Why, right? Let's have reasons for, right, the claim, right, diversity is good, inclusion is good. Why is inclusion good? Should all voices be included? What about the people over there that think, all people that don't have my color skin should die? Is that inclusive enough for those people too? Right, so if your definition is include everyone, who do you exclude? Can you exclude anybody? And so I think having some of those discussions, well, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean those people. Well, you're excluding other, people. Who do you exclude? So inclusion, diversity, those kind of things I think are also important to bring up, so that they have reasons, not to teach them that those are bad things, but to teach them to have reasons for why they believe what they believe. Yeah.
Have you talk a little bit about the very practical aspect of a classroom, of a lecture. The professor stands up for 50 minutes, and he or she hopes to command the attention of the students for that period of time, knowing that students' attention span is not very long. How many of us see them looking at their notebooks or their iPhones, which I think is they also can daydream even if they don't pull out an electronic device.
Right.
And so you did something in our period here. About halfway through, you had us do something as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And so my point is there have to be strategies.
Sure.
If you want to talk about some of these strategies for dealing with the limited attention span of our learners.
Yeah, when I first when I was first trained to teach, which was in my PhD program at Purdue, I remember we had to do a mock, teaching demonstration or whatever, and I lectured, and I was great. I had some PowerPoints, and I sat down, and the person, her name was Jane, was like, no. So basically she said, if you talk more than 15 minutes in a 50-minute class, forget about it. So that was my goal, in my first semester, was not to talk for more than 15 minutes in a 50-minute class, and preferably if that 15 minutes could be spread over the whole 50 minutes, right? Even in a large lecture class, some people, well, I have a large lecture, so I can't put them in, groups or whatever. Well, there's a little thing called think, pair, share, right? Think about it yourself, pair with somebody else, and talk about it, and then as a larger group, share, right? As a smaller group, share with a larger group, right, what you're talking about. And so I would, if I'm teaching a 100-person, 200-person class, I'll put some think, pair, share slides within, right, my PowerPoints. We were just talking about this, or if you have clickers in the classroom, you can take quick polls about student understanding of the material. I was doing some research on the use of some technology in physics classes when I was at Purdue, and I sat in a couple physics lectures to kind of experience what was going on, and they did a lot of polling, like practice questions, in the middle of the lecture, like after 10 minutes, and then they would notice like 90% of the students got the wrong answer. It's like, oh, let's back up and let's talk about this material again. So you can test comprehension as you go along as well. There's statistics that fly out there, and like you only remember 25% of the information after an hour or whatever, and a lot of that's based on like one study. So I don't know how accurate the number is, but regardless, there's a detriment in what you remember, both in terms of free recall and cued recall after a period of time, right? Regardless of what that statistic is, we don't remember 100% of the information, right? And so I think there are some things that you can do, repetition and so forth, to increase students' abilities to comprehend and remember information in the classroom. Yeah.
And speaking of lack of stability in culture, I recall a class in which we had students were engaged in a discussion, and two students began to raise their voices. And after the class was over, one of those students came to me just shaking like a leaf because that had been so uncivil.
Yeah.
Except that's the way I got heard in my culture. If I raise my voice, nobody listened to me.
Right.
So raising your voice is considered uncivil in the wider culture.
Right.
And so a lot of people don't consider it uncivil because that's only when they get hurt in their culture. And
Sure.
when you raise your voice, then people listen instead of.
Right. And that was one of the myths, right? That it's universal or like the notion of uncivil behavior changes based on even subculture, right? Yeah. Background, how you were raised, right? Yeah. So absolutely, I think raising your voice sometimes is the most perhaps civil thing you can do.
So anyway, I have to throw that in.
Yeah.
I've got a question. You're very effective at convincing me that people have different definitions of listening. Mm-hmm. But what does the research say? Like, how many different definitions of listening are there? And how many people are aware that someone might have a different definition of listening than they do? Has anyone done that research, or could you comment?
The awareness part, no. The different definitions, there is some research academic. So this comes from a scale called the Listening Concepts Inventory, and so there's 4 factors, right? So listening as information processing, listening as learning, listening as bonding or relationship building, and listening as kind of a critical competency, the ability to kind of argue or point out, what you said a minute ago is discrepant from what you're saying now, kind of a mentality. I'm doing some work currently with a for-profit company, but we're looking at publishing some of this work that proposes a different kind of 4, and their typology is based on what you tend to pay attention to in the message. So whether you tend to pay attention to, again, I think relationship building is still a factor there, right? So the degree of connection. So am I paying attention to connection, to how, to you as a person, right? As opposed to your ideas. And so, yeah, so there's kind of different typologies, and I think if we took them all and kind of put them in one bundle, you'd see some similarities. So if you had, 10 typologies, each with 4, and you had, 40 potential constructs, my guess is there would be overlap among maybe, and you'd probably come down with maybe 6 or 7 kind of distinct, ways that we might conceptualize listening, right? I've made the argument in some of my research that people who hold multiple conceptualizations of listening actually are more competent, potentially, because they can shift among the various conceptualizations. So they can, when called upon, be information processors or learners or relationship builders or critical consumers, right?
Well, in the interest of not exhausting you as
Yeah.
you're speaking more than listening
Yes.
today, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
And Nancy was mentioning that we might try to do a fact chat about this topic for people who are interested in getting more hands-on instruction in this area, how to incorporate this into your classroom settings, and CETL will be announcing that soon.
Good. Thank you, guys.